Howdy, Brian.
How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing good. We're getting warmer, and it was actually warmer outside than inside today when I
Uh-huh.
came
'Tis
over.
the season.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so we're in that changing of zone there. The time for drinking white tea.
Oh, yeah.
You know, you drink green tea in the summer, which helps cool, and you drink the red or what we would call black tea in the wintertime for heat. And then in those in between seasons is a kind of tea that we don't usually get much of in America unless you're into Chinese teas, which is a white tea. So anyway, that's our fun fact for
Nice. Well, I mean, that actually is related to the topic I'm thinking about today. And I'm not sure where we might go with this. I don't know if it's yeah, I don't know what this might connect up to, but I had a really interesting conversation this morning with a consultant who specializes in bridging cultures between organizations, especially international organizations. And it's made me think about the difference between organizational culture and culture, like German culture and Spanish culture and American culture meaning New York culture or LA culture,
right.
and how kind of our organizational cultures always used to live within these geographic definitions. But in the last 5 years, it's really shifted so that organizational culture is not geographic, and there are pros and cons around that,
Uh-huh.
or complexities around that, whether they're pros or cons. And then we've also got the complexities of trying to manage across the ocean, meaning culturally. Of course, there are logistical challenges too, but culturally. And there are ways in which European cultures, I would use the word intact. They're more intact than American culture. The extended families are more intact. The traditions are more, have greater longevity.
Mhm.
But the fact that American culture doesn't have those kind of roots makes it, I'll say, more nimble in ways, for better and for worse. Less tethered, but also more nimble. So there's just all this like how do we think about that in organizations? And in the context of our conversations, I'm thinking about these different cultural frameworks representing different semantic realities and a potential merging of horizons, and
Mhm.
that goes to dialogue or discourse being the way to merge horizons. But a
Except we're
lot of
at the
people,
meta levels,
yeah, but there's
not
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 always a listening.
interpersonal, but interorganizational is really a meta dynamic.
It's
Yeah,
individual and collective,
right,
right?
right.
And different levels of collective. So, and but there's not necessarily a listening in every management team of a global organization to start having dialogue, right?
Oh,
To merge
no.
horizons.
Oh,
So,
no, no.
it and it kind of amazes me that there are global companies that have been around for decades, that have somehow been keeping it together.
Yeah.
So it's just musing on this topic, and I wonder what it brings up for you.
Uh, well, it's interesting. You know, back in the day, I was an assessor cultural, which is a cultural advisor, but I mean that in the loosest of possible ways. So, but there is something that goes on about that building a bridge, and I mean, boy, is there a lot of otherness in that setting, isn't there? And how much otherness we can integrate becomes a focus. How we enhance our ability to integrate that otherness. How we these are all kind of sideways ways of talking about pulling up that tack.
Yeah, and learning to learn, and it
Yeah.
makes me curious about your martial arts experience or our experience with shamanism, and like what mental models we had to lose or cultural artifacts we had to lose in order to grok what was happening.
Well, and you know what else plugs in with that we've been talking about lately has been this German pre-war and during the war kind of intellectual, lineage. One of the surprising factors about that is the way that it does drill into consciousness, and they have this idea that, I think I mentioned before, Husserl stole from the Greeks called epoche, or it gets called bracketing, and basically, it's recognizing the limitations of our foot nailed down perspective and using pure intellectual focus, objectifying oneself out of that position so that a space is cleared for the true communication of the other. Whether that be, whether it's by not totalizing is the way Lavina said it, or it's by bracketing it out as Husserl said, or when Heidegger was talking about it, he was very much talking about being there, right?
Can you explain again what Husserl meant by bracketing?
Yeah, he goes, of course, into it in great depth and detail and linguisticality, as any German philosopher of that time does. But the idea is to try to reach towards seeing the thing in itself. And so, for example, in the conversation of the bridging of cultures, you see the American system as being nimble. But if you lose that perspective and you step into the perspective of a cultural foundation that has a higher percentage traditional, that's just verging into the modern, as opposed to the nose wiped in the modern and verging into the postmodern, which is where my experience is more dealing with South America and Africa, and not so much with European and other first world countries. But maybe the gap is bigger there, so the places to look for the separations are bigger, are clearer, bigger to see. Um, but from that seat, it doesn't show up as nimble. It shows up as unreliable. It shows up as unpredictable. And part of that nimbleness has to do with innovative ways. Remember, we were talking last time or a couple times back about an organization kind of being designed like a boat because it has to work in a current, and that's a setting where nimble makes sense. But it's also like, think about a kayak, a river kayak. Super nimble, probably the nimblest of boats, and it also, like, goes upside down a lot, right? So you could see where someone coming from a more traditional culture would say, "That thing's gonna go upside down a lot," and you're going, "Oh, but it's so nimble." Right, right. So, one man's nimble might be another man's goes upside down a lot, and, and
But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, and maybe there's a thread here that there's hierarchy amongst cultures. It's not an entirely egalitarian
there is actually, and that's a
environment, right?
very, very tricky thing to say and to explicate.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that is, I think that it really has to do with if you think about cultures as all dots on a map, and each dot is actually a vector because it's moving, and some are moving kind of in the same directions, and some are moving in other directions. And so when they start to bridge, they're not necessarily, this is like two ships that aren't necessarily sailing side by side. And that means that their relationship's going to change over time based on their responses to the ocean that they do share. And so when one is ahead or one is behind, one has to ask in what direction? And and then there's as soon as we say in what direction, we come up, of course, the question is, well, which direction should we be heading for our mutual benefits, given that you're in that boat and I'm in this boat, and that, and all of those things. Because, the solution to the kayak problem, because a kayak is nimble, and it turns out it does go upside down a lot, but it turns out there's a way that they deal with that. So I personally never thought that that was the kind of boating for me. But I didn't expect, because it seemed sketchy to me, I didn't expect, like, everyone to stop kayaking. Because I knew there's a way they work that, and that there is a thing there even though I don't groove that way.
And hunt from it.
I and that's but that's an educational process on my part for me. I guess, did I just disappeared there for a second?
Yeah, lost you at that's an educational process on my part.
Yeah, for me to be able to integrate that and to actually and so that's would be like a culture, be a more traditional culture working with a more nimble setting and saying, well, okay, but there's payoffs and there's insurances against the upside down thing. And so, but I've got to be educated into that, because you didn't just start there. You evolved to that point. You deduced your way organically, if you will, through that, intergenerationally, though it might have been.
There's an ontology phylogeny thing there too.
There
Yeah.
is, and what that means is that from your seat, uh, you're going to be making assumptions about things that would be obvious to them that end up not being obvious to them. That makes sense. And maybe to some degree the other way, but probably less so.
Yeah, one of the examples that came up this morning was servant leadership. It's a pretty well understood idea in American business at this point, which is to say that you get more done, and that gets defined in a number of different ways, right? You retain employees more effectively, you engage them more effectively, you get more ideas out of them, you get more work out of them, you get more things finished, etc., right? So you get more done when leaders embody this kind of servant leadership mindset instead of just being bossy. And that doesn't mean all
Right.
leaders in American businesses do this, but the idea has been around long enough that, you know, anybody in a mid-sized business and up, or in a startup, right, in a tech environment, is going to be familiar with the idea, and, either intentionally ignoring it or trying to do something with it. And when the idea of servant leadership came up in an old school German business environment, it was a complete mystery. And I had assumptions that they would understand the concept and why it was worth considering, even if they weren't going to make the leap. And I didn't even get the headlights coming on, from some people, more traditional German leaders, about why it should even be considered. There was just too much invested in the old paradigm.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that it's important to recognize that that old paradigms are not just intellectual paradigms; they're energetic paradigms. And
I thought you were going to say semantic paradigms. So what is energetic? Because so my interpretation of that is, that energetic is one of those layers we talk about: physical, emotional, rational, energetic, spiritual. And so I guess I see these paradigm shifts. That's where symbols live, right? At the energetic level, that's where kind of values live.
in the sense that I'm thinking of it, it's more as a connection between the material and the mental, which means that, so for example, an energetic dynamic is getting into a groove, and then either, the positive aspect of that would be that the groove can help you do the deal, but the groove can also grind you down and kill you. And so there's dynamic to that that's energetic. It doesn't have really to do with the mental content. It has to do with the interplay of the actual physicality that's going on. So for example, you could have a great genius idea and that you have all of the mental capacity you need to fulfill. But if the physical surroundings you're in, like the only place you have to fulfill this is in a basement of a moldy basement that's poorly lit with an old typewriter, uh, there's an energetic to that that has nothing to do with how good a book you might write, but it does have to do with your connection. But you're because a human being, remember, we're partners with heaven and earth. So part of that, particularly as an artist, one of the things that fascinates that about me is that I have this idea in this mental realm, but I can actually go and do things and have this thing that was an image in my mind then sitting before me. And to me, that's a fundamentally miraculous thing. And so I couldn't do that if I was purely an intellectual being. I have to be in the material realm to interact with all this stuff. So I have to run the meatware somehow. And the meatware has an energetic to it. And that's where, like, here's today's rock and roll reference from Yes, the world's controlling you and me. A Chinese doctor will tell you how your organs plug in with the big picture of things. Not exactly astrologically, but more biophysically, as we were just talking about. We're at a change of seasons, right? So when we experience a change of seasons, we experience a metabolic change that goes along with that. That's energetic. Uh, if we're very depressed, that's energetic. And it's going to affect the meatware and the way the meatware runs, as well as the way the mental component runs. Because to bridge heaven and earth, we have to be able to, and this is the fundamental mystery, right? Is how does this is the hard problem of consciousness. How does that world of awareness and thought and idea and the experience of isness of beingness, how does that actually manifest in the world of stuff? How is it that I have a body that becomes a vehicle that can move me around? And that mysterious bridge that I represent, because that picture was in my head and I had to move the meatware to manipulate the stuff to get the picture to sit here before us. So, there that something about that bridging has an energetic component to it. So now,
Say
think
more about the paradigm being energetic.
the paradigm well, and my relationship to it. In other words, I have to go through certain things. There are certain rules to bringing it down into matter, like first do the first thing, second do the second thing, things like that. But now if we translate it, I'm not working on a painting, I'm working on this boat of collective human enterprise. Now my relationships with other people who also have like we do, I guess my point is we don't just have an intellectual relationship with our semantic world. That semantic world is the pass through for all of our experience on all of the levels of things. So our energetics are in that. If I really want a beer, well, a beer is one of these things in the semantic world, and I'm going to have to exchange money for it, and do a burp when it comes. Like there's a whole materiality and connection to that semantic world, but energetically, my meatware gets into a groove, and it might do the same thing with people. I might react energetically with certain people impacting me certain ways that doesn't have anything really to do with the mental content. It might show up through the mental content. Like a buddy of mine wrote a song called Word Dance. And in the verse it said it's not just the words, but the dance behind them. And so, different dances have different energies to them. They move at different beats. They influence different parts of the body. And so, psychically, that's the same thing. So there's different energetics, and you might be able to get somebody to understand something intellectually or say that they do, but you're only gonna get that energetic that they're used to away from prying it out of their cold, dead fingers. Good example of this from therapy is a military person who's in a position of authority that then goes and tries to have relationships with his family. And he can't change, you can't put off the colonel hat to put on the dad hat. So dad looks an awful lot like a colonel because the colonel can't look like dad. That won't work. Dad looking like a colonel doesn't work either, but you'll get away with it better than you will the other way, right? So that's what I mean, that we get fused to a certain energetic, and sometimes the solution to our situations is not all mental. Sometimes it's mental energetic, and we need to shake up the energetic to stimulate the mental in a different way. Which is, this is all kind of a sidetrack, but my point is that we don't just live in that semantic world. uh,
Intellectually.
Intellectually,
Yeah.
those intellectual components are packets of energetic attachment. They have to have meaning. If they didn't have meaning, they wouldn't wire into me, right? I wouldn't
So
use
my
them in a
model for
world of
that
meaning.
is that all of these layers are there are operations taking place on all of the layers simultaneously all of the time. And so
Sure.
we can talk about a psychological disorder as a chemical imbalance or as a malady of the unconscious, and both of those things can be true at the same time, or as a result of a physical, hanging out in a moldy basement with poor lighting might contribute to a chemical imbalance, or a belief about oneself that show up as a psychological situation, right? So
Right,
so
right.
they're all happening all the time at the same time, and you can just,
And they build a gestalt. Yeah.
and it's dangerous to pick one layer and say, "Here's where the problem is."
There's just
Although
not as much
energetic is a
leverage
better
that way. Yeah.
choosing the energetic layer to work on is less risky than, say, the physical. For we can get into that. But you said something that I want to come back to, which is we have experiences and through our semantic reality. And it made me curious about spiritual or religious experiences that I guess might transcend our semantic reality and cause it to change dramatically. And what your thoughts are about that, because there's also a commonality about those, and maybe I'm wanting to connect that back to bridging cultures. Maybe having disruptive experiences can make that more possible somehow.
I wonder. Uh, I wouldn't immediately connect them. And I think that's because the type of disruptive let me qualify it. The type of disruptive experiences of a spiritual nature that I find interesting are relatively rare. And I think it's almost fair to say that a lot of people will go through life without having them because they're sort of extreme, and without taking certain definite steps, you won't get there. So I'm not sure that those will ever be relevant enough to have impact on a broad cultural level, without going through a lot of integration from those people, into the culture at large. I do think that those types of experiences, and I get the reason that I qualified that is because we can have all sorts of things happen to us that have spiritual impact, that move us to assemble our semantic world in a different way. And some of them can be really traumatic and not positive. And those, I think that maybe it's not predictable how the ball comes off the bat, but I don't find those as interesting as the transpersonal experiences.
Can you define transpersonal?
Well, I think that and I didn't, of course, cook up this term, but there is this idea. We've spoken about it before in terms of uh, Ken Wilber's book, No Boundaries, and the idea that the boundaries can move. So I've got these different layers within myself, a la the discovery of the unconscious. There's the mind body thing, but then I also can go from myself to maybe myself and my significant other, myself to my family, myself to my clan or extended family, myself to my village. You know, these sort of become larger, and and so where we draw that boundary of identity is a slider, right? And so I think that for those purposes of transpersonal experiences, those are the experiences that absolutely defy materialist reductionist worldviews. And so if you've had a worldview that can incorporate those experiences all along, then maybe you won't get shaken. But if you haven't, then you will by definition, because you're on a place now that's not on your map. And to get home, you're gonna come back to your map. So there, you're gonna have a place out there and a line from there to where the normal world is. So now that place has to be on your map somehow. And you're gonna meet people that are gonna go, "There's no place on the map over there. What are you, crazy?" But if you actually do
It's
this in
very
certain
uncomfortable.
ways,
Yeah.
you realize, well, I know you don't know there's a place on the map over there, but that doesn't have to do with my ability to go there, you know? And that's why, in part, why we have different, life worlds, And it may be confusing how we use that idea, and that's, at least partly intentionally so, because what's going on here is a little vague, because we share parts, and parts overlap, which part we share with which person is not always obvious, and then that changes over time as we all are accumulating more and different experiences, and yet a lot doesn't change, and so that puts the changes into a subtler, almost have to pay attention to them to really get it kind of a dimension. And so, but when you have certain experiences, if you have them in a way that you manage to maintain your conviction that your sanity is intact, then you'll know, okay, then this is reality, or some experience of reality that exists, not just of my own cooking up. And that's like some of these experiences of intersubjectivity that might happen in ceremonies. This is not a normal go to the grocery store thing, and one doesn't stretch one's imagination to say, "Gee, if I had never been in that particular type of situation, I could have easily gone cradle to grave and never have had that experience and never have known that that was possible, and I never would have that place on my map, and I just, it just wouldn't exist for me. Wouldn't be a thing." Right? Uh, but for some reason, you did. And so now you have the challenge of integrating that, you know?
So I want to ask the question again. It seems like we filter experiences on the physical plane and on the emotional plane and on maybe on the energetic plane, certainly on the rational plane through our semantic reality, but I don't know if that's as true for experiences that come in through the spiritual plane,
That we filter them?
that we filter them through our semantic reality. I mean,
Well, here's the thing. In most of our experience, we've been told about places to sketch in on our map, even though we haven't been there yet. Someone tells you, "Oh yeah, there's this place called England." I've flown over, I've never visited, never stopped, but I'll take their word for it. There's this place called England, right? Well, so now you have some experience, and and you wake up in this world and all of a sudden you're at a pub and everybody's singing and talking with an English accent, you're likely to tell yourself, "Oh, gosh, I'm in England." Right? You don't know that maybe from the experience. Maybe you're in a movie set where everybody's pretending to be in England, right? But you're just kind of going to say, well, how do I take this experience that's maybe a one off for me? And I got to organize it in there somehow with the rest of the semantic model that has some degree of coherence. So I got to coherently put this, how did I get here? You know, and then where did I open the door that's, Magic Theater? Right? It's a Hermann Hesse reference to Steppenwolf. He goes through the Magic Theater and, everything's a little different, right? And now he's gotta integrate that, and this is not a place most people go. Most people don't even see the glowing letters on the door, right? So, yeah, I think that what happens is we tend to just grab old paradigms and we say, "This must be that, because that's what they've always told me this is like," you know? And I mean, I'm not saying that this isn't the thing to do, because I don't know that we're really gonna end up somewhere new, just because we go someplace that most people haven't been, doesn't mean that somewhere there isn't somebody, and that's where you all of a sudden maybe start reading, like I was very lucky, and I don't know, here we are. Are there coincidences or are there not coincidences? Without going into great details, I had, probably the most significant bending of my semantic world experience that literally left me going, "Whoa, what was that?" And within a couple days, somebody gave me 2 garbage bags filled with books, that they were closing their metaphysical bookstore down. And I had a school at the time, and the guy said, "Here, I'm giving these to you free, just because I know that if they're in the school, people who are interested in this kind of stuff might have access to them. So here you go." Boom. Every kind of thing, just like literally what was off the shelves. But for some reason, out of 2 garbage bags filled with books, I pick up 1 book. Remember our hermeneutical circle, right? Obviously, I hadn't read the book yet. Something made me pick up that book, and I get to page 75. It's a book called The Diamond Light on Tibetan Buddhism. I get to page 75, and here's a ritual, and the ritual is step by step everything that just happened to me, except the main fireworks part where there's an asterisk and a footnote, and it says, "This is advanced yoga. Don't worry about this unless you're under the instruction of a skilled yogi," or something like that. It's like, great. you know, but still, okay, now I have a place to put this on the map. I wasn't the first person that was ever here, because look, boom, 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 boom. And maybe someday we'll talk about that in more length, but
That's interesting criteria. For us to be able to put it on the map, it really helps. Maybe it's even necessary, but at least let's say it really helps to know that someone else has had this experience before and maybe given some words to it that integrated it into someone's semantic reality before.
yeah, or
But
our
but maybe
collective
that's why I was
humans.
asking about spiritual experiences, because I'm wondering about, like, the map itself is also being expanded in some ways, I assume. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe there's nothing new under the sun, and the map that you're referring to already has been mapped in full, and anything we're discovering is really just rediscovering. And so when we find out, "Oh, someone else discovered this," and then we can integrate it, that's the experience of updating our semantic reality. But
I tend
somebody
to agree with
discovered these
that.
places for the first time too, right?
Maybe. I think all the important places, our job is probably to make the roads better. That probably they've been scouted out. It reminds me of a friend of mine years ago who was into Buddhism and had, studied with different masters. He said he asked his teacher once what he could do to help ensure the enlightenment of the human race. How beautifully idealistic we are when we're young, right? And the teacher told him absolutely nothing because the enlightenment of the human race was ensured with the enlightenment of the first Buddha. When he blazed the trail and put the geological survey plate on the top of the peak, then the way there was assured that others would get there. And if others would get there, that was all it's going to take. I presume via the 100th monkey effect. We don't need to get everybody up there. We just need to get enough people up there that the flavor of that rarefied atmosphere becomes pervasive. We're not close yet, right? But that's this idea, like that Chris Langan mentioned. When we're doing it right, we'll be into that. Yeah, and that may well be enough. We may not. Maybe everybody doesn't need to get there. Maybe you just need to know that there is there, and have a grasp of what you know. But anyway, that's the secret, I think, to transforming experience, and that's really what that whole Buddhist idea is about. How do we transform the experience? And that's why it's kind of surprising that that's where these phenomenologists should be drilling down on experience. And of course, they pop up right about the same time that Eastern influence starts to become available in the West. And these were some really sharp guys. Like I was seeing something, and this is of course spurious, perhaps, but where they were trying to estimate the IQs of these different philosophers. A number of the ones that we have spoken about, like Husserl. They said they figured that Husserl was somewhere. Was it Husserl? No, I think it was Wittgenstein. They said was about 190, and and then they mentioned three that they said were pretty much at the pinnacle. Two of them I don't remember being surprised by. I don't know who that would have been, Newton or, you know, but the one that shows the hole in my experience was Goethe, who they estimated at over 200, 220, maybe, something like that. And I think the reason that the world doesn't have access to his genius as much as we might is because he was largely a poet. And so that makes it a little more inaccessible to people. A poet in German. I should point that out.
Yeah. I haven't read Goethe, but my association with him is that he's a giant
Giant.
in German history.
Like
Uh,
Shakespeare, only bigger.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's what they say. I mean, because he was into science, but we also mentioned that
Kind of
he,
a Da Vinci sort of character.
yeah, with a prescience. He, for example, he was reacting to the Enlightenment ramifications way back then. That's I think we might have mentioned once before that he was part of that movement called Sturm und Drang, which is storm and stress. And it was like, if it doesn't make sense right away unless you think about the ideal Nazi officer, right? And the uniform and the whole deal and the demeanor. And this has been done cinematically so well. I know there's references, I just don't have the names. They are the quintessentially unemotional people, right?
For me, it's I think his name's Christoph Waltz in that Tarantino movie. Yeah,
Drinking the
Christoph
milk,
Waltz.
drinking the milk.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, that's the guy I was thinking of too.
yeah,
I just didn't have the name.
yeah.
And what a perfect touch, huh? Drinking milk. But so So what that is certainly not very emotional. Well, all the scientists typically don't express emotion the way that poets and artists do. It's as if they're accessing different aspects of the human spirit, right? Where Sturm und Drang is all of that emotional content that's not found in the Nazi officer, because it's where passion is, and that's of course where we'll find caritas, right? Or caritas is the Latin word that we get the word charity from, and it's traditionally it's neighbor love, right? And in the can't remember who did this. They because we were talking before in our conversations, why are ethics so important almost metaphysically? And they were dividing it up into three, one of these German philosophers, because it was in German, three types of love. Romantic love, pretty much everybody's got that on the map. Love for God, which, at least conceptually one has that. And then the third one was what they called neighbor love. There's actually a Latin word for it, having to do with those around us. And the first two were considered sort of so I don't know what's the correct word to put it, but it's that basically we don't show any exceptional we're not really expressing any moral action by loving God or by having romantic love. Like those are sort of natural and expected, but that we're somehow only really moved out of ourself when we have to express neighborly love. Like so that there's that maybe we love
Experience
God
the
or we
other.
the others are for ourself, and somehow neighborly love is purely other. That the other is there some way. Not to say that there's a whole topic of how the other shows up in romantic love, but that put aside, that's very specific and personal and not generalized in the way that this is sort of implied in that transpersonal sense, right? So, because we were talking about again, you'd ask what does it mean by this idea of transpersonal? It means that my circle has grown beyond myself. It's transpersonal. It's beyond myself. Now, my caritas, my neighbor love can grow, and as an expansion of my consciousness, my responsibility that's represented by the other, as spoken of with regarding Levinas, uh, is now in a place where I can act on it, where I can manifest it, because and that's again that shift from will to receive to will to bestow. And I suppose you could say that those first two, romantic love and love for the creator, can both be in that creator condition or
That will
created.
to receive.
The will to
Yeah, I
receive
mean, they don't
created.
have to be.
They don't have to be, but I think maybe that's what they're saying is there's no
Yeah.
guarantee there. But neighbor love is of a different ilk, and so
So I'm wondering if there's a bundling together of kind of what we've been talking about that takes us back to bridging cultures because
yeah, that's what I was thinking
like
about.
visually I use the phrase bridging cultures because the consultant that I spoke to this morning specifically used that phrase. And then we were talking about roads on a map, which I thought was a really interesting analog, that map
Mhm,
being semantic reality.
mhm.
So yeah, I'm curious. Um,
Well, I think that what so far what we've pointed out is that there's a lot of moving parts. And I think there's a lot of different degrees about what could be meant by bridging cultures, just like discourse. That can happen in a superficial way, where we're just talking about the elements in the contract, or it can happen in a much deeper, more pervasive way.
well, I think if we're talking about culture, it sort of has to be the latter, at least the
Yeah,
way I
yeah,
understand culture, because there's symbols and
yeah,
beliefs, and like there's
yeah.
otherwise it's just window dressing.
I don't know that most businesses would share that. I think that most businesses look at it and they say, okay, what this other culture represents is potential hiccups and issues that we're going to have to get over, and a successful bridging will be measured by us getting as few of those hiccups interrupting our basic procedures as possible so that our plan sails along. And I think very few and rare, and I don't think that conservative capital would even want to hear that, okay, we're now going to really try to come to a deeper than normal cultural understanding between these two organizations that transcends just getting over our misunderstandings, but actually generates a we relationship.
I actually think the emergent understanding is that you can't actually bridge misunderstandings and make those go away without the
Doing the
deeper
deeper work.
mind meld happening. And so so the way organizations I think have tried to do this is with some kind of obvious stuff. And when I say obvious, I mean in hindsight, it's obvious that we would have tried it and that it wouldn't work, like imposing a set of core values across all entities
Yeah,
and trying to that's basically like what I would consider a lowest common denominator kind of approach
sure.
because like everybody knows what honesty is. So we're just going to tell everybody to be honest. Well, but it turns out on
Right.
different maps, honesty means
Yeah.
different things.
Or we could have everybody wearing sombreros on Tuesdays in all of our warehouses throughout North America to show our appreciation of our brethren south of the
Of
border.
diversity, right, that's
Yeah, yeah,
another yeah, right. So it's kind of like
exactly.
the core values rubber stamping
Yeah.
sort of thing, and just put diversity and inclusion as, as just core
Mhm.
values in that
You know the
process.
times when I think this has really worked, where you see countries and making that bridge?
In times of war?
Well, I was gonna say when it's a family that does it.
Okay.
When you have a set of sons that move to the new world and they are doing the same business that the father was in, and they learn what the new world is like, and they take the information from the new world or from the old world and they make it live in the new world, and they carry that bridging within their own lives and their own families. You
It
know,
right, it's not transactional, it's fundamental. Their map has to change, and so they can have bridges that are that
or through marriage.
uh-huh.
Right? Which I think has happened, through history where one of the family members marries into a family of the new place, and then they're going through that, and sometimes it doesn't take, and sometimes it does.
I've always thought of that more as a political maneuver. It's really interesting to think of that as a culture strategy.
Yeah, but I think it is.
Well,
And
and I should have known that a political maneuver would include a culture strategy because again, those are layers. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. And these people are nested within those cultures, so it almost
Mhm.
has to be, yeah. And that's why we had the Pope having a say in the matter.
In which matter? Oh,
Who's
in
marrying
marriage.
who and who's divorcing who
Uh,
and kinda who's gonna become a king and not a king and all that, that's why we have the wands and to do this, you know,
hats.
the hats, the wands, the whole
Yeah.
good thing, yeah. The rings, yeah. So, yeah, it's like, is this a marriage of convenience, or are we gonna have a lot of kids?
Well,
Right? Because if it's a marriage of convenience, then it's like it's pretty laid out what we each want out of this, and we're gonna work it out, and if we aren't getting what we want out of this, we're gonna divorce, right? Whereas the old school way is, okay, we're in this, and we don't know what we're gonna generate together because our union represents unforeseeable, bounteous blessings for both of us in ways that we can't even predict because these two infinities of potential worlds are coming together, right? Totally different worldviews.
I would equate that in the business world to, the marriage of convenience kind of being the modern investment thesis, whether it's venture
Okay.
capital or private equity, that's going to have a position for 1 to 5 years, maybe seven, depending on the market. They're not thinking, I'm building something for the next 100 years and more, like the East India Tea Company or whatever.
Right,
Um, and
right.
and and the
Or
um,
many old great companies that came to America from the old world and transplanted that skill set into a new place. You know what? My buddy, who I grew up with in elementary school and high school, did a great movie. This I'm talking about Stanley Tucci, who did a movie with our other buddy's younger brother, Cameron Scott, and it's called The Big Night. It's available on YouTube, and it's about exactly this. It's about a pair of Italian brothers or cousins, some familial relations that are opening up a restaurant. I think it's in New York, but it's in the new world, and they're from the old world, and so you have the meeting together, and Tony Shalhoub is in it with Stanley. If you know Tony Shalhoub, he was the defective detective, the OCD detective.
Monk.
Wonderful monk.
Okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. And but anyway, that's just a stick for my homie. Uh, and but it is about that, and this is the story of a lot of migrant intergenerational migrations, family migrations. Where it isn't just that the family's moving, but something about the enterprise is moving. And the enterprise that was set up to work one way now has to find a new way in this new setting, and it's sink or swim. That was the story of Zhang Jingfeng, who was a rice merchant who came from mainland China and went to Taiwan, and the environment there was different than he could predict and adapt to. And then the revolution happened, and so unpredictable things, for his business, it didn't succeed. The rice business didn't succeed. That's why he taught kung fu. So this is a story that's been very common, particularly in the past couple hundred years when people could travel and really emigrate. Um, that the enterprise has to immigrate too somehow, and the culture has to morph. And we talked about this just in the general conversation of diversity. Diversity implies a lot of things, and some of the premises are suppressed. And one of the suppressed premises is that the adjective integrated is in front of the word diversity. We just aren't saying it. So we don't want just diversity. We want integrated diversity. We want diversity that's at home and works well with itself so that it represents expansion and innovation and spreading out over the human map. We don't want to translate in the problems that come when it's unintegrated, right? And so what that integration means, I think, is very close to the conversations that we've been having about discourse
Hmm.
and about that meeting of the infinity in the other person, and being willing to be surprised and bracketing the experience, taking away that personal thing so that we can see it from a more transcendental perspective. That's kind of a tall order.
And that's not what the mainstream diversity consultant is doing in an organization.
And it's you probably have to hire for that kind of awareness. I don't know. People work for every different reason, and maybe that just has to do with the nature of the enterprise. And we spoke about before. A piece to have meaning has to live within a context. All meaning is context based. So the meaning of a company is its relationship to the context within which it moves and lives, and how people. within that company relate to that company as qua its relationship to the world at large will qualify their relationship to it. If does that make sense? So them to the little whole is related to the big whole as a part of the very big whole. Those
So
are
so just to play that back, the way I relate to a company that I'm part of is impacted by the way the company relates to the world.
literally.
Yeah.
And by relates, I mean that both actively and passively, because in the passive sense, it's kind of like how it holds itself. What is our conversation within ourselves about who we are collectively within this scene?
I would say internal and external, not just active and passive.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And are we people that move fast and break things? Are we people that that look under every stone? Are we people that find new solutions to old problems? Are we people that keep our head down no matter what? Are we like? There's a lot of identities that we start to have. And you remember we had this conversation before about an egregore, and an egregore is like a psychic entity that people relate to, and they put emotional energy in. And I think that football teams are usually used as an example, or countries, or religious figures, where people it's a concept, but it's not just like held like a concept like you hold up the Pythagorean theorem. People are going to have a different relationship to the concept of the Virgin Mary, for example, for a Catholic, than the way a mathematician holds the concept of the Pythagorean theorem, or a carpenter, right? So why? What's the difference? Well, it has something to do with meaning. But does it stop with meaning? Because meaning's still just intellectual. Isn't there actually an emotional component, if you want to say an emotional meaning or an attachment? If I was just related like I relate to the Pythagorean theorem and my football team lost, I would go, I believe they did not score enough points to win this game, right? And I would have no particular feelings one way or the other about it. But
In
I went to the
Philadelphia
trouble of
in Philadelphia, you would have a very different reaction.
Exactly, but I went all to the trouble of painting myself blue for this,
Green.
right? Nobody's gonna paint themselves blue for the Pythagorean theorem, I'm sorry. As good as it is, as timeless and as sturdy and as useful as it is, nobody gets all up and has a party for the Pythagorean theorem,
Yeah.
but there are people that oh, here's another one, who brings to mind and exercises an emotional relationship with the Pythagorean theorem when one of their loved ones is in danger in the hospital or something like that. That kind of a concept has no currency in that kind of a situation. But other concepts that live in our inner world, like perhaps the Virgin Mary or the Buddhas or just the creative force of the universe, or these are things that we have emotional as well as mental, cognitive kinds of relationships with somehow. And so the idea is that when a psychic package starts to collect emotional energy behind that identity, it becomes something a little bit more than itself. I think we see this with rock and roll bands also, right? Uh, well, maybe there are people with Pythagorean theorem T-shirts. I was gonna say,
I think
but
Tool might have one actually.
yeah, they might exactly. But the idea is that we don't emotionally relate to all concepts the same way. They have different emotional content, and therefore they have different energetic contents, right? Because when people experience emotions, we see definite energetic changes in the meat wear. So this is part of that across the domains from mental to physical,
Mhm.
across that mystery bridge. And so yeah, as far as as far as the companies bridging the gap and the pragmatic problems there, I mean, maybe exchange programs? It depends on the nature of the relationship. I'm not sure that everyone within a company could develop an appropriate relationship with everyone in another company. That might have to live in a special, nervous system within the 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 symbiotic relationship somehow, which might look like, management that's involved in both, or people that are carriers of the cultural mutation that needs to happen, or that become this is where you just hire people from that country, and those people become your interface people. That's a very popular way to solve that. If you want to have a factory in China, have an American Chinese person on your company, and have them talk to the Chinese person. And they may be able to explain the difference in the cultural, but then this becomes definitely this person is a resource. And it's almost like, how do we clone a little bit of that person in everybody else, and that's
And how scalable is that? Yeah.
how
Well,
scalable is it? Yeah.
yeah, I don't anticipate solving it. I think we've kind of done an interesting job touching on some of the philosophical and metaphysical even aspects of this problem. And it's a very practical problem, but it goes deep. Um,
And I think it also explains why you see certain countries constantly acting in concert with other countries and having a difficult time working with other countries because of their cultures. They're already dots that are kind of heading in the same direction, so there can be more consistent cultural relevance than some that are going in different, you know. But then we haven't even talked about the impact of the internet on all this, and the fact that then there's generations that are growing and we're sharing cultures in ways that never before.
yeah.
I mean, used to be American blue jeans and the Beatles, that kind of went across these curtains, these barriers that kept the world separated. And but wow, now it's just there's nothing that's not open. So we're in a new world. We're definitely in a new world just within the past 10 or 15 years.
Well, maybe we'll save that for another conversation.
Yeah. But, I think also a couple notes that just before we close off, again, rewards to everybody that's stay hung with us this far. We're going to have some very cool conversations coming up in the near future here. And they're very relevant to all the other conversations that we've had. So for new listeners, I just want to suggest that if you're just jumping in kind of now in these episodes, it might behoove you to go back and listen to some of our earlier episodes where some of the foundations were laid for some of these ideas. Because there is kind of a theme that runs through the episodes, even though each one sort of addresses its topic on its own. There is definitely a thread that runs through there that contextualizes the next piece. If you've listened to a couple of our previous episodes, you'll recognize that what I'm referencing here is you, the listener, having a hermeneutic circle with fools and sages, so that as you build your association with it, the new pieces fit in this context in a enhanced way if you have the previous pieces. That's all I'm saying. Does that make sense? Did I say that right?
Yep. Got it.
Okay, very good.
Cool. Thank you, Brian.
Yes, sir. We'll see you next time,
Very
everybody.
good.